Okay, so now I am recording. We're going to try to save this for posterity. So I hope that's okay with everyone. Tonight we are honoring our colleague Eugene Schlossberger, who retired in the spring after 28 years of teaching at Purdue Northwest. And he was my colleague for all 28 of those years. And one thing I always like to tell this anecdote. When we were interviewing Eugene for the position, he was coming from a university in Louisiana, where John Rowan, where John Rowan is now, coincidentally. But I got to talking to Eugene about Louisiana politics, and recently, at that time, David Duke, the Nazi and KKK person, had run for governor of Louisiana and had come close to winning. Um, and he secured the nomination of one of the major parties and didn't lose by that big a margin and got a majority of the white vote. And so I was talking to Eugene about that, and I said, "Gosh, how do we explain that? I mean, it's part of our rhetoric sometimes to call someone a Nazi, where it is hyperbole, but in his case, not. He was an actual Nazi. Did the voters of Louisiana not know what it meant to be a Nazi?" And Eugene's response was, "Yeah, I think you're right. I think they didn't really understand what it meant that he was a Nazi. If they had understood it, he would have done much better." So that was kind of a chilling thing. I wanted to say a little bit about Eugene's career before I launch into what I want to say about his work. Renee and I are both going to talk about different aspects of his work. But before doing that, I wanted to just make a few general remarks. Eugene is a very prolific scholar, and he's written three very important books. So the first one is called Moral Responsibility and Persons, which was a very original theory of moral responsibility. And then he came out with a book called The Ethical Engineer, which was a pioneering work. Now there are quite a few works about engineering ethics, but his was one of the first. And then in 2008, he came out with a book called A Holistic Approach to Rights, which was an original theory of rights. And my understanding is he's working on yet another book as we speak. So retirement has not slowed him down in terms of his scholarship. And then in terms of articles, his works are really quite varied. So he's published articles on engineering ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics, civil disobedience, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, and philosophy of religion, among other topics. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was reading one of his articles, the one I'm going to comment on tonight, is Eugene is also a composer. He composes music. And when I was reading one of his pieces, it reminded me of a work of Baroque music, something J.S. Bach might have written, in that it was full of point and counterpoint. So you have this interweaving of different strands of argument. And I'll try to document that when I talk about the particular article by him. So I guess with that, I'll go ahead and launch into my talk. And I'm going to talk about an article of Eugene's called Bad Samaritans, Aftertastes, and the Problem of Evil. And so if you're not familiar with the problem of evil, let me just briefly talk about that. So it's an ancient problem. David Hume traces it all the way back to Epicurus, although that is disputed. Epicurus, who died in 270 BC. And basically, the problem is based on an incompatibility among three items. One would be the idea that there is a God who is omnipotent. And this, as I understand it, would include omniscience, because omnipotence means infinite power, And if one doesn't have the requisite knowledge, one doesn't have the power, to do something. So like if you don't know about some problem, then you don't have the power to fix it. So if God has infinite power, God also has infinite knowledge. So omniscience is sort of folded into omnipotence. Okay, so you have the omnipotence of God. Then you have the omnibenevolence of God, the idea that God is infinitely good, and in particular, sort of infinitely kind, infinitely caring, that sort of thing, that conception of goodness. And then thirdly, the existence of evil. And maybe the clearest way to think about evil would be suffering, especially unmerited suffering. So, for example, the suffering of very young children or animals. And I bring that up because if you talk about the suffering of adults, you get into this whole analysis of maybe they deserve it for being sinners and so on. So it's easier to get into the problem to talk about the suffering of animals and very, very young children. So in David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, he gives this formulation, which he attributes to Epicurus, quote, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil?" So that's essentially the problem of evil. And one thing that I think is interesting about it, I read an article some years ago that the Roman Catholic Church had done a study of what are the main reasons why people leave the church. And number one on the list, dwarfing all other considerations combined, was essentially the problem of evil. People would suffer some horrible, cruel calamity, and they would wonder, where is God? Why isn't God looking out for me? Why would God let this horrible, thing happen? So this is the kind of issue that doesn't just provoke the interest of philosophers and theologians, but many ordinary people. So one other preliminary before I get into Eugene's article, it's important to understand this is really only a problem for theists, number one. Those who don't believe in God, there's no problem because then it's easy to understand why there's evil. And also, the problem can be solved if one thinks there's a God who is lacking one or both of these qualities. So if one were to take the view that there's a God who's very powerful but not omnipotent, then it's easy to understand, okay, maybe there's a God who's powerful enough to create the universe, but not powerful enough to stop all the evil in it. That's a perfectly coherent idea as far as I can tell. Or conversely, there could be the idea of a God who is not infinitely benevolent. Voltaire, for example, in Candide, that's the idea he presents. He gives the analogy of a ship captain who is not overly concerned about the well-being of the mice running around below on the ship. So that's just a little bit of a background about the problem of evil. Now, Renee, I'm now going to ask you to stop sharing your screen because I'm going to try to share my screen. And I am technologically challenged, so let's see if I can actually make this happen. All right, can everybody see what I've put on the screen? Okay, thank you for letting me know. So this is a kind of outline of what Eugene does in this article, although it's even more complicated than I've let on. But what I've got here shows you a little bit of what I was saying before about a Baroque musical composition. So you have, the problem of evil. Then there's a certain defense of it. Then there's Eugene's response to that defense. Then he considers a reply to that argument. Then he's got a rejoinder to that. And similarly with another defense of the problem of evil. And this is even leaving out further layers. So it's a very layered kind of thing. Now, having said that, one of the things that I find impressive about Eugene's work is even though there is that kind of complexity, his presentation is very clear. There's not an excessive use of jargon. There's a clear attempt to communicate rather than an attempt to sort of show off erudition and all that, which one often finds in the atrocious writing of academics. So I did want to make that point. Okay, let me briefly run through some of the highlights of Eugene's article. So I talked about what the problem of evil is. So Eugene also mentions there are actually many responses to it by people who want to defend the idea that there is an all-powerful, all-good God, even in the face of the evil that we find. There are several such arguments, but the two most common he calls the free will defense and the greater good defense. And I think, those are fairly common terms. So the free will defense essentially goes like this. Yes, there's a lot of evil in the world, but the only way God could have prevented that would have been by not creating beings with free will. And then the argument is a world with beings with free will is better than a world without beings with free will. So even though if you have free will, you're going to have murder and rape and assault the recordings of Justin Bieber and things like that, nonetheless, a world like that is better than a world full of robots. That's sort of how it's usually presented. And there are problems with that. I mean, for one thing, you have to then account for natural evil, the evil that comes from hurricanes and floods, and so on and so forth. But there are several ways people fold that into the free will defense. It's sort of like, well, by confronting those kinds of disasters, we develop courage and we develop compassion for others and we develop creativity in solving problems. So it's all kind of folded into this. All right, so that's the free will defense. So Eugene then gives as his response to the free will defense a bad Samaritan argument, as he puts it, and then he ends up with what he calls a weak Samaritan principle. So to speak of a bad Samaritan, so we're not talking about someone who goes out and does evil deeds. We are instead talking about someone who fails to help others in need when they could do so. Good Samaritan, in the Bible, that's someone who helps others in need. So a bad Samaritan is someone who doesn't do that or doesn't do as much of that as perhaps they should. And so one way of pressing the problem of evil is to say, well, if there's a God who's infinitely powerful, it would appear that God is a bad Samaritan because there's so much suffering that an omnipotent being could easily stop. But this omnipotent being doesn't do so. So people have responded to this by saying, well, it's unclear to what extent one has a moral obligation to help others. Some people argue, your moral obligation is not to harm others, not to violate anyone else's rights, but actually going out of your way to help others, that's supererogatory, as some say. You're above and beyond the call of duty. So if God doesn't do that, you can't fault God. Some people say that. And so that's why Eugene calls his principle the weak Samaritan principle, because he says in other contexts, people who argue that way, they at least agree. In other words, people who say you're not obligated to be a good Samaritan, they at least agree that is a kind of ideal. In other words, a person is morally speaking better if they are a good Samaritan than if they're not. So in other words, even if you don't have a moral obligation to help others in need when you have the power to do so, if you do that, all else equal, that's better than if you don't do that. So then there's still a way of pressing the problem of evil in that God fails to meet this weak Samaritan principle. And Eugene, in presenting the weak Samaritan principle, brings in lots of subtleties that I'm not going to go into. He's very, very careful. So just to give you an idea, it's things like he has a proviso that in helping others, you're not doing another wrong or violating someone's right. In other words, there might be some ways you could prevent someone else from suffering, but in doing it, you'd be violating someone else's right. So he considers all of that kind of stuff and has lots of extra little clauses that I won't go into. Okay, so then there's a reply to that. defenders of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, many of them have replied, well, look, if God were to intervene and prevent lots of these evils from happening, it would discourage the exercise of free will. In other words, what people have in mind is, why didn't God stop Hitler from executing Jews and others in the Holocaust? Why doesn't God intervene to stop murderers from shooting their guns at all of these mass shootings we have in the United States? And so some reply, well, look, that's going to interfere with free will. These people freely choose to do these horrific things, and free will has this tremendous value. And so God chooses not to intervene according to this reasoning. And so Eugene makes an interesting reply to this, where he says, well, there would be a way that God could stop these evils from happening without interfering with free will. So, for example, it would be interfering with free will if you made it impossible for a crazed gunman to choose to shoot at people. That would be an interference with free will. But suppose instead of doing that, the intervening is to stop anyone from being hit, make sure that all the shots miss, something like that. Or again, if you were to make it impossible for someone to choose to murder someone with poison, that would be interfering with their free will. But if an omnipotent being were to intervene once the poison has been put into the food or drink and render it lacking in potency so the person isn't poisoned, that wouldn't be thwarting their free will. So there's Eugene's reply to that. So some people then have a reply to that. Here we get this dialectical back and forth that I was making an analogy to Baroque music earlier. Someone have said, well, look, it's not exactly clear. Sorry, let me back up. There's the idea that there could be a kind of chilling effect. In other words, if God were to constantly interfere after the action has been undertaken to make sure that no evil resulted from it, then maybe it would discourage people from even trying. Now, to me, it's hard for me to see that as such a bad thing. But some people put such a high value on free will. They're going to say, hey, we don't want to, stop the mass murderer, from freely choosing to shoot up a playground, and so if God were to constantly interfere with that, then people would give up. They'd say, what's the point? I want to go lay waste to, the local playground, but God's just going to interfere, so why even bother to try? So it would have the same effect as interfering with free will. And so here Eugene has a reply. I've called it the increase by one rejoinder, where he says, well, look, if God were to do that one more time than is already happening, if it's happening at all, that clearly wouldn't have this kind of chilling effect. And you could do one more, and that would, in other words, our world is clearly a million miles away from there being that kind of danger. Now, some people are very impressed by where do you draw the line kind of arguments. And later in Eugene's article, he addresses that. And he says things like, he gives a couple of examples, but I'll just mention one of them. Maybe no matter how hard I try at something, no matter how much effort I put into some activity, I always could have tried a little harder. Let's suppose that's true. Well, it doesn't follow from that I can't in some cases be criticized for not having tried hard enough. In other words, it's obvious I'm nowhere near what would be a reasonable standard. And so that's the same kind of point he's making here. If indeed there is an omnipotent being in the universe, a being with infinite power, it seems there certainly could be quite a bit more intervening to stop atrocities that we currently have. Even if we don't know exactly where you would draw the line such that it would get in the way of free will, we're obviously nowhere near that line now. All right, so now we pass on to a second uh, defense. And for reasons of time, I'm going to go more quickly now for this second half of the paper. So the free will defense is one response to the problem of evil. A second one, Eugene's calling it the greater good argument. And that's the argument that an all powerful, all good God would not make a world that was devoid of evil, but rather would make the best possible world. And the best possible world might include some evil because some evils are useful in producing a greater good. So we're all familiar from our experience with the idea that some evils can produce a greater good. I think a clear example is stuff from the medical world. If you go to see a dentist, and the dentist might kind of hurt your teeth and gums a little bit while they're, giving you a cleaning and what have you. But presumably that makes for a greater good. Your teeth and gums are then healthier. And so many people make that kind of argument where they say all of the evils we find in this world, they're somehow productive of greater good. And that's the rationale as to why an omnipotent, all-powerful, all good God would allow them. So one point to make by way of reply is having to use evil means, or at least, means that involve negative values in order to bring about good, that is the hallmark of limited power. So if my dentist were infinitely powerful and thus had the ability to give me good, healthy teeth and gums without hurting me, then I'd be pretty mad if he chose to hurt me instead. I'm not mad at my dentist because I think he doesn't have the power to do that without causing some irritation to my teeth and gums. And so you can see the application of that argument. Anytime someone says, oh, God is allowing this evil because it's productive of a greater good, you'd have to say, okay, in order to reconcile that with God's omnipotence, you'd have to say, God actually doesn't have the power to bring about that good any other way. And then you have to ask whether that is reconcilable with omnipotence. So in Eugene's paper, he gives what he calls the aftertaste argument. And this is admittedly a trivial kind of thing. And I think he deliberately uses a trivial example to make his point, where he says, suppose there's a certain mint that people like to eat because it has a delicious taste, but there's a slightly unpleasant aftertaste that you get from it. But the initial taste is so good, people put up with that and they still enjoy the mint, even though they're slightly put off by the slightly bad aftertaste. Well, God could just always do a little miracle each time someone eats one of those mints or sucks on one of those mints so that they don't have the aftertaste. And everything else in the universe could be remain the same. Why isn't this done? So a rejoinder, I'm not going to talk about all the rejoinders that Eugene discusses. I'm just going to mention one, the bad parent rejoinder, where, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The we can't judge reply, to which he has the bad parent rejoinder. So the we can't judge reply. So a lot of people at this point will then say, we're just human beings. We're very finite. We can't really judge what God is doing. I mean, there must be some good reason for this that's just sort of beyond our comprehension. And so Eugene makes the argument that, look, parents, when they're dealing with very, very young children, they still have to be able to be a good parent. You have to at least begin to try to make what you're doing comprehensible to the child, and be teaching them a little bit about values and morality and how the world works. Whereas if you want to say, look, it's just a complete mystery, so there's this point that that seems like not good parenting, and then to jump to the very end of the little outline I have on your screen, there's a certain point where that kind of skepticism essentially means, well, we can't really make any kind of pronouncement about God, whether God is good or evil. If you want to say this is just beyond our competence, then the only conclusion is we don't really know. So there's a kind of inconsistency in that people want to say, oh yes, God is infinitely good. And then whenever someone points out evidence to the contrary, the argument is, well, we just don't understand that. So that's a very quick summary of Eugene's article. And really, the only thing I'm going to add, and I invite him to comment on this if he wants to, is he mentioned some correspondence he had with Peter van Inwagen, who's a major scholar on the problem of evil. Sorry, now I'm looking for it. Here we go. And Van Inwagen had suggested the following, that the explanation for a lot of what I've been talking about is that Adam's fall removed humanity's preternatural powers, thus making us vulnerable to random evils. And while God prevents some of these, preventing all of them would make us content with our situation and thus unwilling to participate in the rescue operation God has constructed. And so in Eugene's reply to this, he just makes the point that that story seems from an evidentiary standpoint rather unlikely. But I would add, so here's sort of the one little thing I'm adding to Eugene's argument, is that, well, look, even if that story is true, I'm not sure it would really help, because here we're talking about a situation in which people who were not born at the time are having to have random evils visited on them. I mean, ordinarily, when you're talking about the justification for visiting evils on a person, there would be a consideration of justice. You've done something to deserve that. And if you weren't even born at the time, that's a really rock solid alibi. So there'd be a question of whether it is consistent with infinite goodness and infinite power to have a scheme like that. Other people allegedly long ago did something wrong, and now as a result, random evils will be visited on later people as sort of a part of a scheme to rescue the whole human race. Would that in itself actually be consistent with infinite goodness and infinite power? All right, I'm going to stop there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, first of all. Okay. And Eugene, I'd like to invite you to make any comments you might have on what I was saying.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, I'm here as my wife while my computer is, so I don't mind being Mr. Her.
Yes.
So, so if you want to find me, I'm under Marikar Schlossberger. Okay. First, I agree with that Peter's Just So story doesn't show God in a very good light. So, the point I was making was that it's really hard to enumerate all the very implausible, big stretch ways that people might try to close the loopholes. And all I was trying to point out is that even if somebody does come up with one of these very implausible, big stretch ways to close the loopholes, the most it does is, instead of a proof that God doesn't exist, shows it's very unlikely. That was really the point I was making. So even if there is one somewhere that I didn't come up with, that it still doesn't show that God exists. It only shows it's at least very unlikely. All right, that was the point of that. I did want to say something about the strategy of the aftertaste argument, because when you think about the problem of evil, people think about big evils, right? The Holocaust, and why didn't God prevent the Holocaust? The problem is that when you start with very big things, the causal unknowns multiply. So there's just say, well, but maybe it was all for the best. How can you really know what all the causal ramifications of the Holocaust would be, and what the world would be like if it didn't happen, right? So the strategy I used was to take a very, very, very tiny change. Okay. so that we're not introducing all of these what ifs. And so the change was that this bitter aftertaste after taking the med lasts for a tiny fraction of a second less. Okay. And then to make sure that even that tiny fraction of a second can't make any changes, there's a second tiny miracle shortly after that puts the world back just the way it was. So after that second tiny miracle, by definition, the world is no better or worse than it is in the actual world. It's exactly the same. So the only difference between this imagined world and the real world is during that tiny fraction of a second. And by making it such a small, tiny change, there's no room for what ifs, or maybe it's really for the better, etc. That was the sort of strategy behind it. And I'm not sure that kind of argument really changes anyone's mind. Although the problem of evil is certainly a very powerful one. It's important because when theists are confronted with what I would call common sense, they like to say, but there isn't absolute proof. There's no proof. So these arguments are supposed to be, okay, here, you want proof, here it is. But what really drives, I think, atheism is perhaps best expressed by the simple word, really? I'll give you two kinds of examples. First, if you or I behave the way God is supposed to behave, everyone agrees there's something wrong with us. If I were a mad scientist and created in my lab puny, weak beings of limited understanding whom I commanded to worship me, I would be, quite properly, accused of having mental problems, right? I mean, there's something unhinged about that. But that kind of megalomaniacal kind of egoist is precisely the standard religious picture of God, at least in Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, less so in Buddhism. Again, what kind and just God would hide themselves, demand that you believe in them despite the silence, lack of evidence, and punish those who don't? And imagine a lover who refused to show up or even speak to you because you're supposed to love them anyway and have faith, right? And then tortured you eternally if you didn't. Isn't there something wrong with that person? Isn't there something wrong with someone who plays those kinds of games? Yet, again, according to this religious picture, that is how God behaves. Second, it's just obvious that this world was not created by a kind being. And I'll just take one example. So let's grant that there has to be a cycle of life and death. But does death really have to be so painful? I mean, we couldn't just peacefully slip into oblivion when our time comes. Instead of, like many patients, suffering through months or even years of pain and degradation. Can anyone really believe that couldn't be avoided, right? Or that a kind and good God would really order such needless suffering for billions of people? I really couldn't come up with a less horrible way to achieve whatever good that's supposed to achieve. And then, of course, there's also the question of, is it okay to use people suffering in that way for whatever purpose? David mentioned this, right? To use people in that way, make them suffer for some greater good, even if you're going to reward them for it later in heaven, right? So we have a newborn infant suffers terribly and dies very young. We said, well, somehow that created greater good for others. And it's okay for the baby because he or she will get rewarded in heaven, right? But think about if I just randomly slap my child and said, don't worry about it, I'll make it up to you later. Would that be acceptable behavior? But that, again, is the standard story that religions tell. Okay, so the real thing I think that motivates atheism is that sense of really, because if we just use common sense, these kinds of stories don't seem to apply to our world at all.
Very good. Thank you, Eugene. Let's open it up to everybody else who's here, and you can go to the chat, or let's see. I'm going to put the view on. You could try just raising your hand. Are there any questions or comments, Renee?
I would just make a note to the group that as one of the co-hosts, I've been muting microphones as we go. So if you'd like to raise your hand and ask a formal question, just remember to unmute yourself before you get started. All right, I'll keep going, David. How about that?
Sure.
So really quickly, Eugene, how do you see the sort of greater good arguments that you're addressing in relation to more specific kinds of theodicies, like a soul-making theodicy, where it's not really about the greater good in some sense, but about providing a certain kind of suffering on earth for humans so that they can develop the relevant kind of soul so they can earn the right to have a heavenly afterlife. Is that captured in your greater good argument, or is that a different kind of wrinkle in response to the problem of evil? And how would you respond to that one?
Okay. There's sort of two responses on the two fronts. There's the argument I gave in the paper, which is the aftertaste argument. And there, again, I think it would be really hard because of the second miracle that to insist that by making the aftertaste last just a tiny bit less time, we're preventing the flowering of the journey of the soul. But because remember, the second miracle sort of restores the status quo ante. It restores us to the world we have. So I don't see how that argument can even get started against the aftertaste argument.
I see Janusz's hand. Janusz.
And then, as far as the broader one about, it's again hard to see.
Yes, I had a question about the definition of evil for Eugene. Do you define evil as suffering the way David did? Or is it something more fundamental, that evil is the destruction of existence or of life? Because suffering can be beneficial. If I'm not mistaken, Aristotle said that doing good things and suffering through that actually makes you even a better person. So is evil really suffering, or is it something more basic like the destruction of life or of existence? What do you think, Eugene?
I missed some of that because my internet was unstable, but let me try and answer what I heard, and if I'm missing some of what you say, let me know. Okay. It's known as the problem of evil. Actually, the way I've formulated, for example, with the bad Samaritan principle, it's really talking about harm to someone and avoiding that. The weak Samaritan principle is very weak. It just says if you can prevent some unearned or innocent harm to an innocent person without harming anyone else, without undue trouble, without it, it's very, very weak. That it would be better if you did. So it's very hard to argue with that. But there are certainly lots of cases in which, if God were all powerful, he doesn't do that. That's sort of the.
Yeah, my question.
It doesn't really depend upon a robust definition of evil. I mean, it's just that, for example, getting hit with a bullet and killed is not a good thing. That's really the kind of assumption it makes. So they're very weak assumptions. And in the aftertaste argument, it's just that it's other things being equal, and the point is they are equal. The second miracle guarantees that other things are equal. it's better to have a pleasant taste than an unpleasant taste. That is, if you looked at Leibniz puts it in terms of the best of all possible worlds, right? Because Leibniz argued that if God is omnipotent and God is benevolent, because God could create any world she wanted and wants to create the best world she can, being benevolent, and God created this world, this must be the best of all possible worlds. That's Leibniz, right? And so philosophers have turned that around and say, because this isn't the best of all possible worlds, right? There can't be a God that's both benevolent and omnipotent. And so the trick is just showing this is not the best of all possible worlds. And so my assumption is that if we imagine two worlds that are exactly alike in every other respect, except that somebody had an unpleasant taste for a fraction of a second in one, and had pleasant taste for a fraction of a second in the other, and in every other regard they were the same, then the one with the pleasant taste is better. But since God didn't create that world, God didn't create the best of all possible worlds, and hence God is not both omnipotent and benevolent. That's basically the argument. So the assumption about evil or they're very small assumptions.
So let me just note that we have a question from Donna Witten in the chat. Dionish, do you want to do a quick follow-up now, or should we come back?
Just very briefly, how do we know what worlds are possible? We know what worlds are possible for us to imagine, but we don't know what worlds are actually possible. But that's it.
Donna, you have a question.
I wrote it in the chat, but basically, if you could address the binary of, what I would call the carrot stick, heaven, hell issue, sort of the all or nothing of that binary. When you talk about evil, when you're always talking about a spectrum, you've mentioned several definitions of evil that aren't binary at all. And yet, how does that evil fit in with that carrot stick, heaven, hell? I don't know if you understand the question, if I said it clearly.
I think that's a question for you, Eugene.
Yeah, I couldn't hear it. I lost it broke up.
So Donna, can you state your question again?
Can you hear me now, Eugene?
So far.
Okay, let me know. You put your hand up if you kind of lose. But it was just an issue of the binary of sort of that carrot stick, heaven, hell. And then when you talked about evil, you really mentioned the idea that it's more of a spectrum and how you look at it. And yet we have this binary of sort of all, nothing. How does that issue of evil be addressed by that binary we're always given?
I'm getting some syllables and not others. Is this the question that about binary character of good and evil? Oh, wait a minute. No, that's not it. Okay. Because again, the argument doesn't really make any robust definitions of what is good or evil. It simply assumes that two particular things, one is better, whatever else is better, or whatever else, however else we define. Because it's very often easy to make small particular judgments when we disagree about the principle involved, right? So in one case, it's just that a bitter aftertaste is not as good as a pleasant aftertaste, everything else being equal. In the other case, it's the assumption that being killed by a bullet is more harmful than having the bullet miss. And those are the only kinds of assumptions about good or evil that are being made. They're very small assumptions. I'm not sure if that answers, because I couldn't hear a lot of the syllables. Does that answer what you were asking?
I'm not sure. I guess I just wondered the philosophical reasoning of the binary we're always given of all or nothing, when everything seems to be on a spectrum, even of evil. So how does that binary how does that survive for so long, and how does that placate people in their idea of evil? And we can move on if I'm breaking up.
I'm actually just going to suggest that we have
If
three
you
other
repeat it,
comments, and some of this may come out as we address some of those issues. So if not, we can come back to it. But I do want to let some of these other folks join in conversation with you. It looks like Kathleen Nielsen, unless you'd like to unmute yourself, I'm happy to read your comment out. As in the chat, it says, it would be so interesting if we could see the results regarding Hitler through parallel universes, or having access to parallel universes. This would settle the question of whether the Holocaust was ultimately a good thing. We can't imagine that it was, but we might be able to see a world with or without it having happened, and then be able to come to an ultimate kind of conclusion about that. So it's a comment rather than a question, but Eugene, since it raises the issue of parallel universes, and that's an anticipation of the second half of the talk, is there anything that you'd like to contribute in response to Kathleen's comment?
no, it's just that I would agree that our ability to trace out all of the possible consequences, given all of the possible decision trees involved, would be extremely limited. So whereas it would certainly be interesting if we could see that, I don't really think that's being able to see that is something we can achieve.
Could I jump in and say something about this? Because I wanted to also say something in response to Janish's question earlier, because I think this is also relevant to this point that's been made about the Holocaust. It's true that in the world as we find it, suffering often brings benefits. We learn from suffering, we grow from suffering, and so forth. But then the question is, why is the world that way? Could an omnipotent being create a world in which we could get all those benefits without having to suffer in order to do so? And then as to what is possible, if we're talking about omnipotence, there are no limits in terms of what's physically possible. There are no limits as to what's technologically possible. The only limits would be what is logically possible. So I would say an omnipotent being couldn't make something that was all round and all square at the same time. You know, that kind of thing can't be done, cannot be done. But there wouldn't be any other limits. So one would have to say that somehow it's logically impossible for the benefits that we get from suffering to be achieved without suffering. It seems to me that that would be the burden to make a case for that.
So I think we should let Bruno ask. He's let me know privately that he has some comments and questions. So Bruno, please do feel free to share them with all of us and Eugene.
Yes, thank you. I have a few questions. I said, like any work of art, any masterpiece, you realize that the masterpiece, to be truly a masterpiece, if you look at the, for instance, the Botticelli, the Venice of Botticelli, there's a little slight of imperfection. And if you don't put the slight imperfection to a masterpiece, it's not truly a masterpiece. So is that an argument that could be sustained? That's one of my questions. And also the other thing, if we were living in a world of bliss, and if we had no concept of evil or pain, would we be enjoying the blessing the way we do? Because we wouldn't have any point of reference. that's the second point on which I'd like to have your opinion. And also the notion of evil and the notion of pain is something very subjective. Even today, everybody is referring, I would say, to the Holocaust and etc. But even today, there's pain throughout the world. And if you ask people, I would say in the Middle East, in South Africa, South America, wherever in the world, what is the definition of pain and the definition of evil? Their definition may be different than ours. Hence, I would say our definition of evil and our definition of pain is subjective. So it is not an absolute value that can be, I would say, evaluated or judged, I would say, objectively throughout the world. So these were some of my questions. Thank you.
Eugene, I think that's directed at you.
I missed the very
yes.
end, but I think I can answer most of it.
Why don't you move there? Because I can hear better there. Don't do that. I have my computer on here.
I'm gonna switch. I apologize. I'm gonna switch computers.
I can hear better.
Yeah.
My question made the host flee.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, okay. There's a sort of the technical answer and the broad general answer. The technical answer is that the cases for the argument in the paper were chosen to be very narrowly defined to avoid those problems, right? For example, with the aftertaste, you can't really say that without the bitter, that tiny okay, without that tiny bit of bitter aftertaste, you wouldn't be able to appreciate even good food, much less everything else, right? Because it's that tiny bit, taking away that tiny bit of unpleasantness doesn't prevent you from having knowledge of what is less than perfect to appreciate what is better, right? And the same with the bad Samaritan case, right? That if this person doesn't get shot and killed, it doesn't mean that they haven't had experiences of pain and suffering to be able to appreciate pleasure and etc. So the cases in the paper were narrowed precisely to avoid having to speculate about those sorts of things. It seems to me that they eliminate those worries. With that too.
Yes, he does. He answers the question by narrowing the subject. Okay, thank you.
I also note that in the chat, and I'm not sure, Delanis, our participant under that name, has provided a couple of comments. And so this might be, at least I'll read one of them. And if you'd like to jump in, Delanis, and add, please feel free. The first comment was, I feel as if you limit God's knowledge at certain points, which is of course not meant to be the point of this kind of argument. You say that common sense would prevent you from hitting your child and saying that you will make it up to him, her. In other words, common sense would regard that as a bad behavior. However, God from scripture has all knowledge far greater than our imagination. So do you think that some of your points or your strategy are actually inadvertently limiting God's abilities, or is it just that you personally view God as limited? So I think this might clarify the nature of the problem you're trying to address, if you can respond to that, Eugene.
Okay. Yeah, again, there's the limited context for the formal argument of the paper, right? And then there were my broader remarks at the end. and the one about hitting your child is from the broader remarks at the end, right? Because I don't think that comes up in the two cases where God's knowledge is limited in those cases in any way. And I don't see that that's an issue in the two cases in the paper, right? That was the reason I chose the cases as I did, to try to narrow it so the kinds of things people have traditionally worried about with the argument from evil don't get a chance to arise, right? But in terms of the broader, the idea was with hitting the child and saying, I'll make it up to you later. I'm not sure that knowledge really plays into this, because the problem with it isn't the possibility that greater good will come from hitting the child, right? The problem is that saying, I'm going to make you suffer now, but it's okay because I'll make it up to you later. We don't really accept that as an acceptable way of dealing with people generally. So that's really the issue. That's not the model of the perfect moral being. So I don't think knowledge really comes into it.
I wonder if this would be a good time, Renee, for us to transition to the second part of the program. What do you think?
That sounds great to me. And I also just want to acknowledge there's still conversation happening in the chat. So please do feel free to add more thoughts there. We can always pull these down and record them, and maybe you and Eugene can continue having conversations after tonight. I'm now going to pass the co-hosting chat board responsibilities to David. And I sort of want to start the second hour by saying, and now for something completely different, a la Monty Python, for two reasons. One is I'm going to be talking about a very different element of Eugene's work, and a very different sort of way that his work is presented and developed. So David was focused narrowly on arguments from one specific paper, and I'm going to be talking about something that's, I think, much broader in scope. So while David was talking about thinking of Eugene's work maybe in terms of a Bach invention or a sinfonia, I think I'm getting into his work as a symphony or a concerto or some sort of other massive magnum opus here. We'll try to stay focused even as we take on a very different perspective and approach to his work. The second thing that will make this completely different from the first half is that in honor of Eugene and to honor his work and all the wonderful philosophical conversations he's had with me since before I was hired. So that would be my anecdote about Eugene. He started having them with me immediately following a presentation in the classroom on my job interview. So Eugene has been inviting me into philosophical conversation about all kinds of things for as long as I've known him. And so to honor that, I actually wanted to create something that's a little bit more like what I would present in a Festschrift for the American Philosophical Association. So traditionally, when I give presentations here at PNW, they have fancy PowerPoints and I chat a lot and wave my hands in the air. Today, there'll be quite a bit less than that. There'll be a PowerPoint just to help you sort of track a few key ideas, but I am actually going to read my remarks on Eugene's work so that I make sure that all of the important points actually come through clearly. Before I do that, I would, following on David, like to just make a couple of other comments about things I've learned about Eugene as a philosopher going forward. So what I'm going to be remarking on is actually chapter 5 of his forthcoming book, is the manuscript he's currently completing. It has the working title, Responsibility Beyond Your Fingertips. And he's thinking about all the ways we might be morally accessible for things that we don't directly do or things we might not have immediate control over. And as you'll see in a minute, there's really a wide range of those. And I think this is really an element of the literature that's underrepresented in general, sort of thinking about responsibility beyond our fingertips in the way Eugene does. But again, just to sort of underscore David's earlier point about the fine distinction making and argumentative dialectic that's characteristic of all of Eugene's work, I'm just going to read you a little bit of the second paragraph of the introduction to this book. So he says, answering such questions, and I'll tell you what they are in a minute, is what this book will seek to do, and it requires paying closer attention and making finer distinctions than is the norm. Now count this, just keep counting. For example, evaluating claims of collective responsibility requires distinguishing between 4 kinds of collective activity, 6 types of subjectability for collective activity, 6 possible grounds for assigning subjectability, and 3 ways answerability for a collective activity may be generated, as well as separating original from successor responsibility and distributed from non-distributed responsibility. And addressing questions about responsibility and addiction requires distinguishing between 6 dimensions of addiction, and we are in paragraph 2 of the new book. So clearly this is such a major work, there's no way I'm going to be able to do it justice. So I decided to focus on chapter 5, which has many things to recommend it, but one of my favorite features is that it highlights certain aspects of what I've come to know of Eugene as a colleague in philosophical conversation. And one is that he's a systems builder. This actually used to be how philosophers did philosophy. There wasn't any great distinction between worrying about metaphysics and worrying about ethics and worrying about epistemology and worrying about aesthetics. Everybody was doing everything, trying to generate a coherent system. Now, people like me are piecemeal philosophers. We work in a little tiny corner of a little tiny subdiscipline, fine-tuning little dinky questions, and we say, oh, all that difficult stuff in the philosophy of language, all those troubling questions with respect to testimony, we're going to leave them to the side. But Eugene doesn't function that way, and this book clearly shows how his work falls at the intersection of all philosophical disciplines. This particular chapter I'm going to talk about, which is called Counterfactual Responsibility, shows how his work in metaphysics, specifically his theory of counterfactuals, intersects with his work in metaethics, specifically his theory of moral responsibility. So I think that's a real wonderful feature that Eugene has, because it takes a lot of courage as well as intellectual acumen to be a systems builder. Eugene has always been such, and I think this is a great place where we can see that. I think it's also a really wonderful example of Eugene's use of cases. So without getting into details about features of his theory of moral responsibility, which I think will emerge in his comments to me, his methodological approach is always very contextual. He cares about the details of a particular case in a particular situation, which is sometimes more broadly referred to as a particularist approach to metaethics. And it's also case-based. So to David's point earlier, despite all these distinctions that Eugene draws, his writing's really accessible because every move is motivated maybe by a theoretical case, maybe a thought experiment, as in this case, or by application to an actual case. So today we're going to focus on one case and on some of the things Eugene says about it. And in my experience with honorary reflections on a person's career like this, the nicest thing you can do to someone is offer a bunch of friendly criticisms or challenges. So where David spent quite a bit of time articulating Eugene's argument, I'm just going to give you Eugene's argument on the front end and then start throwing down a few gauntlets to see what he'd like to do with them as he continues to work on chapter 5 of his forthcoming book. So now I'm going to try to share screen, and I'm going to go ahead and, as I said, read through the presentation rather than talking in an impromptu manner. And let me get back to the beginning. Oh, whoops. My apologies all. Hey, Eugene, while I do this, would you like to address 2 basic questions from me? The difference between attributionism, which actually Eugene is responsible for creating, and voluntarism, and also why you focus this chapter on moral luck.
Okay, the first question. The traditional view of moral responsibility that has held sway for over 2,000 years is that we are morally responsible for things that are voluntary, that is, things, and that's expressed in different ways. Sometimes that it's expressed as things that we freely chose, sometimes things that are within our control, sometimes expressed as things that we chose or that we willed, but it's got to be voluntary, basically. And if it wasn't voluntary, it's not your fault. You can't be held responsible. Okay. So when I came along and I thought that was totally wrong. Everybody else is wrong. And actually what we're responsible for is who we are. And it doesn't really matter how we came to be the person we are, but we're responsible for who we are. And so that ultimately we're responsible because who we are as moral agents is a worldview in operation that is a complex network of shifting attitudes, values, perceptions, understandings, ways of responding to the world, and so forth, that makes us the distinct individuals we are. So worldviews include fleeting things and long-term things. Worldviews change over time, but we are worldviews in operation as reflected in the way we live. Okay, and so as long as our worldview is reflected in the way we live, we're responsible for our worldview, ultimately, for the people we are. Usually, in most cases, if something is not in my control, then it doesn't show much about my worldview. For example, if you push me off a small ledge and I fall on someone and hurt them, the fact that I hurt them doesn't show anything about my worldview, because no matter what my values were, no matter what my attitudes were, no matter what I cared about, it wouldn't matter. I would still fall on them, right? So the fact that I fell on them doesn't show anything about me. But in other cases, there are things that might be not in our control that do show something about us. And the first case that I used in my first publication on this is our emotions. So, for example, if Charlie just gets a kick out of seeing animals suffer, and maybe he doesn't do anything to make animals suffer, but when he sees an animal suffer, he gets excited about it and it gives him pleasure. It would be a moral improvement if he didn't feel that. Now, whether or not he can help feeling that, okay, he's a worse person because he does, and he would be a better person if he didn't. And so Charlie is morally responsible for his emotion, at least that one, even if he couldn't help it, because it shows what kind of person he is. And he would be a better person if he didn't feel that emotion. Okay, so that's the idea of attributionism, that we're responsible for basically for who we are. And I formulate it as our worldviews. Whether or not we could control it, whether or not we freely chose it, and so forth, because we are who we are.
And so, Eugene, could you say a little something about moral luck? Some members of our audience will be very familiar with this concept. For those who aren't, it comes in 4 different flavors, but you focused on just a particular one in your account of counterfactual responsibility. So maybe you could say just a little bit about that, and then we'll launch it.
Okay, the problem in moral luck is rather interesting, and particularly if you have a voluntarist view, as almost everybody else had, because so much of our moral status is really a matter of luck. I'm careless for a minute, and when I'm driving and I go up on the curve and nothing happens, big deal. But if someone happened to be on the curb when I did that and I killed the person, that would be a big deal. It was just a matter of luck that no one was standing there, right? This Nagel called circumstantial luck. there are other forms of luck, resultant luck. If let's say I fire a gun up in the air and the bullet comes down and doesn't hurt anyone, that's one thing. But if the bullet comes down and kills someone, that's morally much worse, but it's really a matter of luck where the bullet landed. Right? You know, it's sort of a celebratory discharge of firearms that people do, unfortunately.
And why?
That's resultant luck. So there are different kinds of moral luck that he articulates, and he thinks that's a real problem, or many people think it's a real problem, because morality should not be a matter of luck, right? Many things are a matter of luck, but not morality. And yet it appears in many ways it is a matter of luck. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, is there anything that you wanted to say about why you chose to focus on circumstantial luck, as in the case you just gave about the car on the sidewalk, in your discussion of counterfactual responsibility?
Oh, well, this chapter again had a limited purpose. It's not that the other forms of moral luck are uninteresting. And in fact, I do say something about some of those other forms elsewhere, particularly in my first book on moral responsibility. But I really trying to show, again, an example of responsibility beyond our fingertips, namely how we can be responsible for something we would have done but didn't do.
And that's a perfect seg to what turns out to be the first paragraph of the book at this point. And I just wanted to start with this, both to highlight the particular question we're going to talk about today, and also to sort of whet your whistles and imagination about all the possible ways there might be responsibility beyond our fingertips. And in order to get this really better, let me get that down. So here are Eugene's opening lines. "You can't blame me," and "I hold you responsible" are phrases heard ever more frequently nowadays. Questions about blame and responsibility seem increasingly to dominate both the headlines and private conversations. Are leaders like Donald Trump responsible for random acts of violence performed by their followers? Are all men responsible for rape? More broadly, is it true that, quote, "this entire patriarchal society is responsible for every single sexual assault that occurs"? Are you to blame if, though you take no action, you feel attracted to your spouse's sibling? More generally, are you responsible for your emotions? Are you to blame because you would have caused a scene had your ex-lover shown up? Are you morally responsible for what you would have done under different circumstances? And this is the particular case in the question we'll focus on today. But in addition, we could wonder, should addicts be held morally responsible? One answer to these questions comes from the common intuition that we can't be responsible for what we can't control. Don't blame me, I couldn't help it. If that is right, the answer to all of these questions seems to be a resounding no. Conversely, if the answer to any of these questions is yes, then it seems we can be responsible for things beyond our control. And as I mentioned before, these are the questions the book seeks to answer. In fact, they follow the chapter structure of the book, and we're going to focus on what Penelope would have done. So, can I be morally responsible for something I did not do, but would have done if given the opportunity? For instance, can I be morally responsible for the fact that I would have stolen my sister's inheritance from her if our father had had any money left at the end of his life to bequeath to his children? Schlossberger argues that the answer to the question is yes. In at least some cases, he claims, we can be morally responsible for the things we would have done, but did not do. In other words, he defends the view that counterfactual responsibility exists. How does the argument proceed? It begins with what I'll call the basic case provided by Schlossberger, which reads as follows. Penelope, hereafter P, decided that if her husband Raji attended the wedding reception of their joint friend Susan, to which they were both invited, she would walk over to his table and throw a glass of champagne in his face. On the way to the ceremony, a random nail punctures the tire of Raji's car, as a result of which Raji does not attend and no reception disrupting event occurs. So just this much is what I'm going to call the basic case from this point on. Just for clarity regarding the abbreviations that follow, the letter P refers to Penelope, that is Penelope in the actual world, as she is described in the basic case. And P star refers to Penelope in a different possible world, or if you have a different sort of metaphysical preference and you're a modal realist, to Penelope's counterpart in a suitably close possible world. So following his presentation of this basic case, Schlossberger offers 4 limiting conditions to help us focus clearly on only circumstantial moral luck, using them to rule out constitutive and causal luck and leaving considerations about resultant luck to the side, since, as he tells us, quote, the conclusions drawn even about the narrow range of cases discussed has significant consequences for any theory of moral responsibility. His 4 conditions are: condition 1, that the agent has decided to do something reasonably specific, call it X. And in this case, X is throw the champagne at her X. Condition 2, the antecedent of the counterfactual constitutes a relatively circumscribed change in the specific choice repertoire available. Let's make that simpler. In other words, either the X attends the wedding or he does not. So either Penelope has the opportunity to choose to throw the drink at him or she does not. So that's a very small range of relevant choices. Condition 3, while any change in circumstance affects an agent's worldview to some degree, in the alternative situation or in the relevant set of possible worlds, P star's worldview, that is P star's values, attitudes, propensity, etc., is very similar to P's. This condition actually does a number of things, but I think the most important for our consideration tonight is that it secures something like a same personhood condition, so that Penelope is not being held morally responsible for something that a different person does in another possible world. And condition 4, the discussion in this chapter is restricted to examples in which the agent did not perform the intended action, as in C1. And I think this focuses us explicitly on cases of moral responsibility that lie beyond our fingertips. So after a detailed analysis, Schlossberger concludes the following. Given the caveats addressing these 4 concerns, it seems undeniable that P star's throwing the champagne shows a moral blemish in P, to the extent anyway that throwing champagne indicates a moral flaw. P does not escape Arietaic appraisability. She's a worse person to that extent. Some will argue that this is all moral responsibility amounts to. But even if there's some extra dimension to moral responsibility, no compelling reason to absolve P seems evident. It does not seem unfair, I will suggest, to blame or resent P for what P star does. That is, for what P would have done if her ex had been present at the event. So we start with friendly challenge number 1, which focuses on the difference between actual intentions and counterfactual actions. Some, namely those with voluntarist intuitions, will respond intuitively by claiming that Schlossberger's appeal to counterfactuals is simply otiose in this kind of case. Such a thought might go something like this. If P is morally responsible at all, then this is because, in the actual world, she had a full-fledged and uncoerced intention to throw the drink should she see her ex at the wedding, an intention that she presumably endorsed reflectively. As a result, what plausibly grounds P's moral responsibility is what she actually did, namely plotted to throw the drink, rather than what she would have done had her ex appeared. Given that at no point in the basic case does P question this intention or worry about its moral implications, this seems to be a clear-cut example of scheming to do something that's at the very least socially awkward, if not downright morally untoward, perhaps even unduly malicious. Now, Schlossberger anticipates such an objection, and he offers the following rejoinder. And here we're back to David's point about the wonderful Baroque invention or symphonia that we find in all of Eugene's work. Schlossberger says that pinning moral responsibility on intentions or intentional choices is problematic because, for one thing, it seems to result in an infinite regress. One can, I think, avoid this potential worry by following a recommendation offered famously by philosopher Harry Frankfurt with respect to higher order desires and the development of volitions, which has also been criticized for potentially inviting a regress. Frankfurt suggests that the regress can be blocked pragmatically, though not logically, because there are natural psychological limitations with respect to embedded or hierarchically ordered acts of consciousness. Though the details of this proposal are much too complex to articulate here, I mention this point simply to offer Schlossberger the opportunity to comment on the topic of intentions to act and the role that they play or do not play in his overall theory of moral responsibility. So this brings us to the meat of my commentary, friendly challenge number 2, which focuses on actual reactions versus counterfactual actions. One might reasonably wonder, what exactly was P's intention in Schlossberger's basic case? Was it to shame her ex, or simply to cause him a bit of embarrassment? Was she hoping simply to ruin his fancy suit? Or did she yearn to blind him, even if only temporarily? Was she planning to perform an act of justified retribution or of unjustified vindictiveness? In light of such questions, one might first argue that additional clarity with respect to the content of P's decision to throw the drink is needed to assess the overall moral character of her scheme, and this, I submit, would be true whether one is a voluntarist or an attributionist. In other words, Schlossberger's basic case appears to be morally underdetermined as given, a point to which I will return at the end of my remarks. But perhaps more importantly, and more to the friendly challenge number 2, one might ask this question. Within what context did P's mental act of intending to throw the drink come into being? And in what circumstances did the choice to do so, if she could, persist? Amplifying the details of the original case in relatively small ways, while holding the basic counterfactual situation fixed, will have significant consequences with respect to the reactive attitudes we adopt naturally, and even perhaps appropriately, toward our friend Penelope. So this is the storytelling portion of my presentation. To this end, we can imagine several plausible scenarios in which P decides to throw the drink, satisfying condition 1. She would have thrown the drink had her ex attended the wedding, satisfying condition 2. Her worldview is held constant, satisfying condition 3, and her ex does not appear, satisfying condition 4. That nonetheless differ with respect to P's reactions to the actual situation, and hence affect our moral assessment of P in substantive ways. So version 1. In this version of the story, the outcome is going to be that P is relieved. Let us imagine the following. P gets to the wedding, realizes her ex isn't there, and she breathes a sigh of relief. Although she had never given up her original plan, P was becoming increasingly uneasy about it as the time of drink throwing approached. In particular, despite the growing moral conflict she was experiencing, P was worried that her characteristically short temper would likely get the better of her. As a result, she was glad that her ex didn't show up, because this stroke of fortune saved her from herself, or more formally, from acrasia. In this case, what we generally regard as an instance of circumstantial moral good luck, P also countenances as such. Now imagine a second adumbration of the basic case. In this one, P gets to the wedding, and she fumes that her ex doesn't show up because she's no longer afforded the chance to express her anger by embarrassing him publicly in front of their friends. All she wanted to do was throw that drink in his face and watch him squirm, and circumstances beyond her control have stymied this satisfaction. Hence, she might regard his failure to attend the reception as a case of circumstantial misfortune, though from a third-person perspective, we would likely still call it circumstantial good luck, since she was denied the opportunity to exhibit her irascibility, which is generally held to be a blameworthy character trait. Moreover, P might well regard this as a case of circumstantial moral bad luck, if she believed that the calculated drink throwing was warranted in light of her ex's behavior or abuses. Perhaps he often threw beverages at her in public, or even worse. So in this scenario, P's assessment of whether the circumstantial luck is bad or good might diverge from ours, i.e. from that which we morally justified from a third-person perspective. And this deviation seems relevant to our overall assessment of just how blameworthy the attitudes that enabled P to originally decide to throw the drink and to continue to plan to do so without any emotional conflict might be. So then we imagine a third version of the case. In this one, P really wanted and carefully plotted to throw the drink, and she never wavered in her commitment to this course of action up to the time of the reception. However, in the end, it didn't really matter to P when her ex didn't make it to the wedding. She moved on quickly and never gave her previous plan a second thought. That is, she didn't feel deprived of some kind of deep satisfaction or an important opportunity for public retribution. In this scenario, she might not regard her ex's failure to show as a case of moral luck at all, though we would probably still regard it as an instance of circumstantial moral good luck. So I think when we take these cases collectively and just sort of canvass our intuitive responses to them, there's a tendency to think that Penelope's reaction in version 1 of the case is sort of the best of the 3 here, that her reaction in 2 is sort of the worst of the 3 here, and that her reaction in 3 is maybe somewhere intermediate between best and worst. And when I say best and worst, I just mean relative to one another. I'm not saying that P's being relief is necessarily morally admirable in and of itself. So what does this sort of variation show with respect to our intuitive ranking when we just think about P's actual reactions rather than the counterfactual truth that she would have thrown the drink had her ex been at the wedding? So these variations in our assessments depend on additional information about how Penelope regarded her own situation. The key question they raise is this: did she see her ex's absence as a misfortune, a blessing, or was it of no real importance to her? In addition, they indicate collectively that we intuitively regard P's worldview and operation as more moral when her assessments align with those that would be taken from a third-person perspective with regard to either the valence or the presence of her moral luck, and less moral when they diverge from this point of view. Furthermore, considerations of these kinds inform our assessments of P's moral scorecard, and this is one of Eugene's terms of art, without any need to rely on the claim that P is morally responsible for the fact that she would have thrown the drink had her ex been there. What they show, I think, is that all we need to justify and generate our reactive attitudes toward P is a sufficiently detailed accounting of her intentions, emotions, and actions, as well as of her reactions in the actual situation. The additional consideration that it's counterfactually true that she would have thrown the drink if she'd been given the chance doesn't seem to add anything substantive to our intuitive ranking from best to worst in the cases I've asked us to imagine so far. So now this takes us to friendly challenge number 3, in which we consider the possibility of there being additional circumstantial luck that Eugene's basic case doesn't countenance. So one key and very important feature of moral luck is that it's pervasive. Hence, even if we focus on only circumstantial luck, the difference between the 3 cases articulated so far might well be a matter of happenstance with respect to the slightly more specific situations in which P actually finds herself. If so, even though it is stipulated that in all 3 cases P throws the drink if given the opportunity, one and the same P working from substantially similar worldviews might be morally accessible in different ways or to different degrees as a result of additional circumstantial luck. And that's going to be, for my definition, moral luck over and above the fact that her ex didn't make it to the wedding reception. If this is correct, then it casts doubt on the suggestion that the initial kind of circumstantial luck Eugene addresses in Chapter 5 is really doing the relevant moral work in this particular case and others of its kind. So how could additional circumstantial luck enter the picture in a way that would affect our all things considered moral evaluation of Penelope? There are an infinite number of ways as it happens, but I promise I'll only consider 2. So let's take the first version of the amplified basic case, the one in which Penelope develops some doubts about the morality of her plan, while still acknowledging that her Arietaic orientation will definitely motivate her to follow through with it if she can. Well, where did these doubts come from? One possibility, in one possible world, is that they might arise simply because, as she's getting ready for the wedding, her mother reminds her that she's prone to outbursts of temper that do not yield positive results. Perhaps mother recounts to P a few stories from her past, just in passing, and for no reason directly related to the postulated basic case. Mom's timely comments on P's quick temper are rather a matter of pure happenstance. Now let us suppose that, had mother not raised the issue, this fact about her own temper and its consistently poor outcomes wouldn't have been in P's mind when she attended the wedding. Hence, she wouldn't have had to worry about the very high probability of losing her cool when faced with her ex, and wouldn't have regarded this as a case of good moral luck when he didn't attend. This now seems to be a case of double circumstantial good moral luck. With respect to the final assessment of Penelope, it's lucky that Mom raised doubts in her mind, since this inspired good, honest moral reflection on her actual character traits and flaws. And it is doubly lucky that, in the actual world, her ex did not show up at the wedding, since this prevented P from relapsing into a kind of behavior that even she recognizes as blameworthy. How else might additional luck enter the case? Well, let's consider the third version, in which Penelope makes the plan to throw the drink, but remains entirely neutral about being unable to carry it out due to the absence of her ex. This, too, might be a result of additional circumstantial moral good luck. Perhaps Penelope meets the man of her dreams at the wedding, and all thoughts of vengeance are immediately pushed from her mind in light of the budding romance. Or maybe the celebration is just so darn enjoyable that Penelope simply forgets about her plan and focuses only on the pleasures of the day. Alternatively, it could be that someone informs her immediately prior to the ceremony that one of their mutual friends has been diagnosed with terminal cancer, which appropriately takes over Penelope's attentions and concerns. Though this is certainly bad news, it is still a case of good circumstantial moral luck for Penelope, since it attenuates or overrides her focus on personal retribution and brings out her more laudable, sympathetic character traits. Now, to remind you, in none of these amplified scenarios do we need to imagine that P's worldview is substantively different from the worldview in operation in Schlossberger's basic case. In every situation, Penelope's traits, motives, desires, and value hierarchy remain the same at the moment of developing the intention to throw the drink and all the way through to the moment she discovers that her ex will not be in attendance at the wedding. However, the ethically relevant aspects of Penelope's worldview are mobilized in different ways because of additional circumstantial luck that has nothing at all to do with her ex's failure to show up. And these ethically relevant aspects of her worldview then manifest themselves in her reactions to the actual situation. So what's the upshot of this series of thought experiments? Two theoretical challenges are suggested by the scenarios I've sketched. First, my amplified cases call into question the degree to which Schlossberger's appeal to counterfactuals is theoretically necessary. For as we've seen, what seems most relevant from the perspective of our justified reactive attitudes toward P is not simply, as some voluntarists might say, her intention to throw the drink, but rather is her actual reaction to being unable to throw it, and her concomitant assessment of whether this circumstantial fortune is good or bad. Second, these cases indicate that the counterfactual situation provided by Schlossberger's basic case is insufficiently specified to robustly ground any particular reactive attitude toward Penelope. Schlossberger assumes, I think rightly, that we will appropriately regard Penelope as having some kind of a moral demerit or a blemish for planning to throw the drink, given the additional stipulation in his case that she would have done so had the circumstances been different. But I submit this could be too quick, as put, because in the case where she does not throw it, we might have three different, equally justified reactive attitudes toward P. Now, Schlossberger will likely say that the truth of the counterfactual he discusses in Chapter 5 is merely a pro tanto reason to regard Penelope as less than fully morally good. That is, it is one that can be overridden by other situations, such as my remarks about how she responds to not having had the chance to throw the drink. The truth of the relevant counterfactual is, as he might put it, only one entry in her moral scorecard that could result in a few ethical demerits for Penelope. But the critical point that begins to emerge from reflection on the more detailed versions of Schlossberger's original scenario is that ascribing moral responsibility or justifying our reactive attitudes by appeal to counterfactuals seems fundamentally problematic, since, by hypothesis, it is true of P, given only very modest further specifications of the basic case, that she deserves counterfactually to be the subject of conflicting or competing normative assessments. In version 1, Penelope deserves a significant kind of praise for being sensitive to her own areataic shortcomings, even if she cannot overcome them in practice. Whereas in version 2, she warrants a weighty kind of censure for maintaining her vindictive attitudes toward her ex without any further evaluation or moral reflection. And in version 3, it would seem appropriate to regard Penelope with at least a modest kind of admiration for being able to move on in a positive direction and let go of both past harms and her original plan to seek reprisal for them. In other words, the fact that in all three cases Penelope would have thrown the drink doesn't tell us what she's actually occasionally responsible for, and hence which reactive attitudes are most appropriately applied to her in the actual world. Thus, the counterfactual situation, as described by Schlossberger, leaves it indeterminate what a moral scorecard really is. Now, just to be clear, the worry broached here is not, as some would have it, that the counterfactual approach to ascribing responsibility will result in runaway responsibility or much too much responsibility. Instead, my concern is that it will be ontically, thus epistemically indeterminate what kind of reactive attitude P deserves on the basis of what P star does. This is at least in part because we recognize that what P deserves with respect to our reactive attitudes depends both on her actual reactions to her ex's absence and on what kind of additional circumstantial luck might have brought these reactions about. It is, after all, quite a different expression of her worldview, her attitudes and values, if P simply forgets about her plan because she's able to relax and enjoy the day, than if she does so because she's told that a close friend is on her deathbed, or because she suddenly finds herself in the throes of a new romance. Now, I presented Schlossberger's account in Chapter 5 in this particular manner for a very specific reason, to honor his body of work. Namely, his philosophical methodology is highly sensitive to both general context and relevant details. This is part of what I meant when I earlier mentioned that his approach was case-based, and this is also part of his broad commitment to the metaethical view of particularism. So, it seems to me that to understand more fully the role counterfactual responsibility plays in his larger theory of moral agency and assessment, it is quite licit for us to attend to the degree to which Schlossberger's robust contextualism might seem to be in tension with his treatment of morally relevant counterfactual. So there are many other aspects of Eugene's thoughtful discussion in this chapter and his panoply of arguments throughout the book that deserve detailed consideration. But I'd like to close by offering him the chance to share his views on two topics that are related to those I've been exploring. One is the subject of constitutive moral luck and its connection to being or becoming ultimately responsible for one's worldview. The other is the seemingly intractable problems presented by the mere acknowledgement of moral luck, which Thomas Nagel describes as having a, quote, unavoidably paradoxical character, and Bernard William tells us is a genuine pathology of the moral life. These are large and extremely complicated topics, and I'm certainly not inviting a substantive treatment of them by Schlossberger in this forum. However, in light of the systematic complexity of his fully developed account of moral responsibility, I think it would be both appropriate and illuminating for him to remark briefly on how his theory of ultimate responsibility avoids the difficulties posed by constitutive moral luck, and on how his unique form of attributionism has the resources to resolve deep tensions in our ethical thinking that emerge from simply recognizing the very possibility of moral luck. And with all of that, I really want to say thank you, Eugene, for all the wonderful philosophical conversations so far, those we will have in future based on this work, and many congratulations on your illustrious career, your retirement, and this imminent volume. Thank you for letting me read an early version.
Okay. The best gift you can give a philosopher is a good objection. So thank you, Renee. You gave me two. But in order to respond particularly to the first one, I have to tell you a little more about the machinery that I introduced for my view of moral responsibility. Okay. Because the idea is that we are directly responsible for traits or features that we evidence that show something about our worldview. But not just any traits, they have to meet certain conditions. And I think the most important one is that they have to be sufficiently specific. So for example, having told a lie. Well, unless all lies are equally bad, no matter what the circumstances are, that's not enough. You have to give us enough information that we can make a moral assessment. Okay, so the traits have to be include all the information we need to make a moral judgment. Okay, and that's what we're directly responsible for. What we are occasion responsible, second kind of responsibility, occasion responsible for are those things that are occasion a judgment of moral responsibility. For example, suppose that I spit on my neighbor because I'm angry at him in an argument. Okay. Now, my spitting on him reveals certain things about my worldview. But what? Well, that's a long, complicated story. And it's going to be different, right, from somebody else spitting on his neighbor. So we're directly responsible for all those particular traits that involve, for example, my attitude towards spreading disease, because spitting on him poses a danger of that. Exactly what I'm trying to express with it, to what degree do I disrespect my neighbor as a human being? All of those things, there are many of them, right, that are involved. And the particular traits that I have, that's what I'm directly responsible for. I'm occasion responsible for spitting on him because my spitting on him occasions judgments of responsibility for those particular traits, whatever they happen to be. Okay, so what I was saying is that Penelope is occasion responsible for the fact that she would have thrown the drink. What she's directly responsible for depends on the particular story about Penelope. And it's a complicated story because there are many traits. I think that's one of the virtues of my view is that, you know, in the traditional voluntarist view, if you slapped somebody and you did it voluntarily, you're responsible for the slap and the story. On my view, the slap just occasions a lot of judgments that really give you a complicated moral scorecard. And your performing the slap may involve very different traits than my slapping somebody, and therefore we get a very different moral scorecard. Possibly a few good things, possibly a lot of bad things. We get this full data report on our moral set, right? So absolutely, how Penelope regards her exes not showing up makes a difference in how we evaluate Penelope, because it makes a difference in what she's directly responsible for. But what I was arguing for is that she's occasion responsible for the fact that she would throw it. So maybe one way of putting the question is, why is occasion responsibility important? Why does it matter? Why do we have it at all? And I think it's necessary to clarify things that might otherwise be confusing or hard to express. For one thing, we can all agree that you should apologize for calling Susan fat, even if we can't agree upon exactly what attitudes you're doing so revealed, or why they're bad. Right? But we can all agree you shouldn't have done that. So one of the things that it does is to indicate a relationship between the agent and what was done that needs to be explored. I can blame Joe for stealing from me or choose not to go to his birthday party, punish him in some sense, without knowing all the details about how bad it is. And obviously, one person's stealing is different from another's because it's a different story, right? You have to look at the whole story to get it just right. But we often don't need to get it just right, and we often can't get it just right, and we often have to function without being able to get it just right. So we blame Joe for stealing from you without conducting a detailed inquiry into his state of mind. Okay. And in fact, sometimes that's the way we question, we raise a question or begin a moral conversation, saying you're responsible for the death of my parent, occasion responsible, right? Point out that you have something to answer for or explain, and then how the conversation continues will bring out what you're directly responsible for and what your actual moral scorecard is. Okay, so that's one part of that. Once you say now about why the counterfactual at all, Once you say that Penelope is responsible for her emotions, attitudes, and so forth, that is, she's responsible for her worldview directly, right? You've already given me what I need about direct responsibility. And since some of those emotions and attitudes are both about what Penelope would have done and are attributable to Penelope because of, on the basis of what she would have done, it seems clear that Penelope is occasion responsible for what she would have done. That she would have thrown the drink occasions judgments of responsibility about Penelope's actual worldview. Okay, so I think that answers what you were getting at. Second objection was about intentions. Can't a voluntarist say what Penelope is responsible for is her actual intention to throw the drink, right? Which is voluntary. And in fact, that's sort of something like what Adam Smith said, that we're responsible for our intentions. It's a view that has a long pedigree. But there are problems with it, okay? One is the regress problem that I mentioned, and that I don't think the practical limitation helps here. The idea is this, okay? You can give me most of what I want and be an attributionist, right? You can say that you're responsible for our intentions, however we come to have them, voluntary or not, okay? And then I'm happy with that, except that I'm not sure why you're limiting it to intentions, because there are other things we're responsible for. All right, but most who are tempted to view intentions as the bearers of responsibility, like Adam Smith, are voluntarists. Right? They think we're responsible for those intentions that are voluntary, that we freely choose, and so forth. But when you say that, now you have a problem. Because in order to be responsible for an intention, you had to have properly chosen it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be voluntary. But for a choice to be proper, it must be intentional. So in order for your choice to intend to have been properly voluntary, you have to have freely intended to choose to intend. Otherwise, if that didn't happen, your choice wouldn't be voluntary. But for that intention to have been free or voluntary, it must have been freely chosen, and so on forever. And if the intention choice hierarchy is this infinite regress of intending, if it can't go on for more than a few levels, that would mean that intentions can't be freely chosen. Right? It doesn't solve the problem, it puts a nail in the coffin. Okay. But I also mentioned, besides the regress problem, second problem, which is about identity conditions for intentions. Is Penelope's intention to throw the drink different from her intention to get back at her ex? Which one is she responsible for? We can quickly see that Penelope has an indefinitely large number of intentions about the drink, that she intends to express her anger, she intends to get revenge, she intends to throw the drink with her right hand, etc. Either that or she has one big intention that includes her entire mindset. So you either has sort of indefinitely many intentions or one big intention that includes all of that. Okay. That is the intention of getting back at her ex by throwing the drink with her right hand while feeling anger, etc., etc., etc. Right? It's sort of reminiscent of Davidson's Great Fact, if anyone's familiar with that. If Penelope is responsible either for that big intention or for all of these indefinitely many intentions, the claim that she's responsible for intentions becomes increasingly no different from saying she's responsible for her worldview, because her intention either singly or includes everything about her mindset. So I don't think the move to intentions helps at all. Okay, and finally, you invited me to say more about moral luck. So it's a huge topic, a fascinating one. So I'll just say a few really brief things. Okay. The problem seems to be that people feel that moral luck isn't fair and morality should somehow be fair, right? Totally fair. And that's particularly true because they think you're responsible for what's in your control, but moral luck seems to show that an awful lot is not within our control, right? That's why Williams, right, called it a cancer. That's why he calls it a cancer, because it seems to undermine all of morality by showing that so much is not in our control. And of course, from my view, control doesn't really matter. So cancer surgically removed. But there's still a lot of luck that remains that maybe life's not fair, right? And that's my response. Life isn't fair, get over it. But what my view does is make the unfairness about moral luck less bad. So it's tolerable unfairness, right? Because clearly how good or bad we are isn't absolutely and perfectly fair from the beginning, which I call absolute justice ab initio, right? Because it does depend on your genes and your upbringing and all of that, right? And that's deeply troubling, I suppose, if you believe in a completely good creator who rewards the good and punishes the bad, and is completely fair. But I don't, as the first part of our session showed. So putting that worry aside, let's look at just how bad the problem of the unfairness of moral luck is. And my view eliminates some of the problem because control isn't necessary. Attempted murder is no less blameworthy than successful murder, although we may be more lenient about attempted murder for a number of reasons, one of which is we're less sure. Maybe if the person didn't succeed, maybe they weren't totally committed, or maybe they would have stopped at the last minute, or maybe, so there's the uncertainty with attempts that's removed by success, right? But that doesn't really change the moral situation. It's just how certain we are of their moral situation. Also, punishment, as in the law, depends upon a lot of factors in addition to how guilty, blameworthy the person is. The law has to balance many factors. Okay, but an attempted murder is really an attempted murder, it's really trying to do it, etc., is no morally better than someone who lucks out because the bullet misses. Okay, so that it doesn't really change that bit of circumstantial that didn't, or result in luck, depending on how you set up the case, doesn't really change anything.
Hey, Eugene, I hate to interrupt you.
Oh, we're out of time?
I think we're going to be out of time in 5 minutes, and I just want to leave enough. I think we're going to lose the Zoom thing in like 5 minutes. So I just want to give the audience a chance to ask any other questions or make any other comments, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So let me open it up. Is there anyone who has a comment or a question for Eugene?
Well, David, I don't have a comment specifically about the content, but on the occasion of Eugene's retirement, I hope, if it's all right if I just say one or two things.
Please do.
Remember the day that I met Eugene, which was December 29th, 1996. And I remember it because it was the kind of intimidating experience that leaves an impact on one's brain. I was interviewing for an assistant professor position at Purdue Calumet. David Detmer and Eugene Schlossberger were the interviewers. And after a nice exchange with David, something about sentience as the basis for moral standing in fish and that kind of thing. Eugene asked if I addressed stakeholder theory in my business ethics course, and I said yes, and he pounced. It's like, but surely you admit that stakeholder theory can be distorted into this, so as a 20-something vulnerable, graduate student looking for a job. I thought I had blown it. But thank you, Eugene, for giving me the opportunity and for being a wonderful teacher and mentor and friend for all the years that have passed since then. It was my privilege to work with you for all those years, and it's a heartfelt, with heartfelt gratitude. I wish you all the best, my friend.
Thank you. And I do want to say that at this moment that interview was over, I said to David, can we ask the dean if we can hire him today before he leaves? You obviously did a great job. And I want to say that I've been extraordinarily lucky, speaking of moral and personal luck, in the colleagues I had. And I've been in other places where philosophy departments and other departments were acrimonious, but I've had nothing but a wonderful experience with my colleagues at Purdue, and I'm extremely grateful to all of you for that. Renee asked me to speak a little bit about, I don't know if we have time for it, about philosophy and life. Do we have time for that, David? Or
Do you know if it's just going to stop? Do you know if it's just going to stop all of a sudden?
I don't know for sure. So go for it, Eugene, and you might get cut off or maybe you won't. But why don't you go for it?
Really quickly before you
Renee?
I'm sorry?
This is Maricar.
Hi, Maricar.
Hi. So it will ask you if you want to continue.
Okay.
Then just, click continue.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So very quickly, I also just want to send, in addition to the thank you, a kind of apology to Eugene. Because of the timing, we were originally going to do this last spring when your retirement was official. Because of the world, the great party and graduation, right, retirement present, didn't come together. So I hope you will consider these remarks on your work as the gift from us. And as your book is published, I think we'll be really excited to continue to do this, which I hope you regard as sort of the best gift we could give in any case. So apologies and thank you for so much to work with.
Well, thank you. All right, well, philosophy and life. Philosophy ultimately is where theory meets life. The word philosopher, as we all know, means lover of wisdom, and wisdom resides in bringing an insightful and sophisticated understanding into the activity of leading a life. My work as a philosopher bridges theory and practice. I've written about abstract subjects like logic, Aristotle's metaphysics, definitions of autonomy, but ultimately, philosophical theory helps us lead our personal and professional lives and conduct social policy. My theory of moral responsibility says something about whether we can fairly blame a friend for feeling jealous of our success. You can. And about whether we can fairly, and about what kind of insanity defense the law should recognize. My work in business and engineering ethics talks not only about when to use thermostats instead of recyclable plastic, and when a business should relocate to increase profits, but also about what we owe to our society. Privacy is a good example of theory helping us lead our lives. It's something we talk about and care about, but it's really hard to say what it is. It's not just keeping information secret. When the Supreme Court said that outlawing oral sex violates the right to privacy, they were not talking about information at all. Now, I've argued that human beings are social individuals, right? Unlike ants, we're individuals with distinct life goals. And unlike the solitary red panda, we need to be an integral part of a community. Privacy rights focus on the balance between these two. They give us aspects of our lives that we can keep apart from our community, things that are private, not social. In our society, The shape of your thumb is not private. It's not withheld from the community. Anyone can see it. But the shape of your genitals is private, something you can withhold from the community. Okay. If we understand privacy rights this way, as giving us adequate room to keep part of our lives separate from the community, it helps us set social policy as a state and relationship policy as individuals. In a relationship, it's vital to have some form of common life, what we share with a partner, and some things that remain our own alone, what we keep to ourselves. The specifics of what is private and what is not are less important. Right? What is important is that whatever compromise we reach between, for example, the state gaining information to stop terrorist attacks and respecting the privacy of our emails, or whether couples should have the password to each other's phones and emails, that whatever compromise we reach leaves us enough room to feel we're deeply linked to, but not mere cogs in, our community and our relationship, that we have both value as distinct individuals with our own aims and a deep connection to those around us. At a more personal level, philosophy is a way of life. The aim of philosophy is arriving at truth wherever it leads. It doesn't matter who said it first. A philosopher wins an argument, whether with a fellow philosopher, a lover, or a workmate, when we discover or come closer to the truth, even when it turns out that the other person was right. When I'm angry at someone, my first question to myself is my anger justified? If so, then I'll address it with the person, trying to explain my issue as clearly and fairly as I can. If my anger is not justified, then it's my problem, not theirs. And I try to work through why I'm angry and how to let it go. When philosophers fight with a spouse or a friend, ideally, we try to look at the issue fairly, think clearly, offer reasons and arguments for both sides, because again, our goal is to arrive at truth, to determine what is right, even when that means we don't get what we want or have to apologize. We're not saints, of course, and we all fall short of this ideal at times, but it's how we want to live and how we try to live. And philosophers are curious. Aristotle said philosophy begins with a sense of wonder. And to a philosopher, the world is awash with things to wonder about. Even something very simple like raising my hand, right? We all do it all the time. Easiest thing in the world. But what is it we're actually doing? Command your hand to rise. Up hand. And nothing happens. Wish it to go up or hope it to go up. And it just sits there. Will it to go up. Nothing happens. But we feel we're doing something. It doesn't just happen. But what? And that's just one little thing. So much to wonder about. So I've retired from the profession, but I've not retired from philosophy. As long as I have breath and a mind to wonder, I will be doing philosophy. And so I hope will all of you. Does anyone have anything else to say? Or
I thought that was beautiful, Eugene.
thank you.
Well, maybe that's an appropriate note to close on. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I know we're all so very, very busy, and Eugene certainly deserves this honor. And I want to thank all of you for participating in that. Yeah. So
Thank you all so much for everything, not just for this, but for all the years I've been here.
well, thank you, Eugene. All right, I think I'm going to try to end this. Do I push the stop recording button first? Does anybody know? Yeah, Renee, you'll do that, or I should do that? Okay, I'll push that.